Good evening. As most of you know, I'm Sarah Coakley, Mallinckrodt Professor of Divinity here at Harvard Divinity School and co-director with Professor Martin Novak of the Program for Evolutionary Dynamics of the Templeton Foundation-funded research project on evolution and the theology of cooperation. Tonight is the first in this year's collection of 4 lectures in our continuing series of interdisciplinary explorations on evolutionary biology, theology, and the phenomenon of cooperation. Last year's lectures may be watched, if you wish, on stream if you visit our website, and the remaining lectures for this year are also advertised there. Tonight, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce Professor Philip Clayton, who is serving this year as a visiting professor in our research project on leave from Claremont, where he is Ingraham Professor of Theology at the Claremont School of Theology and Professor of Religion and Philosophy in the Claremont Graduate University. Professor Clayton is without doubt one of the leading scholars and researchers in contemporary science and religion in this country, and indeed worldwide, having trained in this area first at Yale and then also at Munich, where he was later a von Humboldt visiting professor. He is the author of a very large number of important books on science and religion, both authored and co-edited. Most notably, Explanation from Physics to Theology, 1989, God and Contemporary Science, 1997, Evolution and Ethics, which is co-edited with Jeffrey Schloss, 2004, Mind and Emergence, From Quantum to Consciousness, also 2004, and most recently, In Quest of Freedom, The Emergence of Spirit in the Natural World, which is a very important book forthcoming next year in both German and English simultaneously. He's also the editor of the new Oxford Handbook of Religion and Science, due out very shortly from Oxford University Press. Philip, it's wonderful to welcome you here to assist us with a major piece of our thinking about how contemporary evolutionary biology and theology should relate, and we await your wisdom on the topic cooperation in biological and religious contexts, credible and non-credible models for bridging the gap. Thank you.
Thanks very much. See if I can set this up here safely. It's one thing to watch a lecture come crashing down, but watch your own laptop come crashing down would not be comfortable. Is that right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have to admit to the temptation to write a beautiful talk tonight and to spin out words about the moving way in which theology and theories of evolution might be wedded together, to write you a literary talk, to satisfy your aesthetic sense. And I found I couldn't do it. The topic is too difficult to waste any language on beautiful words. And so rather than pleasing you with an attempt to spin this beautiful story, I've decided tonight to worry you, to make the task as difficult as possible. I think, in fact, it is incredibly difficult. And then to offer suggestions for making the bridges. Some of these suggestions will satisfy different members of the audience. About 6 I find unsatisfactory out of the 8. Right? So if you will allow me not to do the formal lecture and to sort of roll up my sleeves, if I may, or actually take off my sleeve, and turn this into a working session, that would please me more. And that's conveys my sense of how difficult the issues are, and in fact how important the issues are. It's an incredibly complex set of questions. And you should be sitting in the audience now, hearing the title of this large Harvard program, The Evolution and Theology of Cooperation, and hosting a certain amount of skepticism within yourself about being able to carry that out. It might even be the PIs have their own certain worries about how to do this. And I'd like to take the bull by the horns and concentrate on the core question of ETC. Right? It's risky, it's threatening, but I think we have to look at the real issues if we're going to make any progress. So if I can break some academic rules, that would be my interest in the talk, to make it really a working session. So roll up your sleeves, Bring out your skeptical side and then see if, under the premises of the project, what you think might actually work. All right, first let's talk about assumptions in the title as it stands there. The first assumption, of course, is that game theoretical models are important. I take it that the development of mathematical biology is a major step forward in our doing biology in a fully rigorous sense. Modeling comes automatically with the attempt to do mathematical biology. Modeling behaviors of cooperation, defection, and punishment would be right at the core of a biology of behavior. Right? So I presuppose that that's something we can't go back from. Yet, at the same time, there's a gap between that work and the theological approach, the standard ethical approach to treating human behaviors. I'm going to try to evoke that gap in a number of ways, not through lofty theologians, but through some of the core texts, Jewish and mostly Christian scriptures. So let's just take this text. Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Whoever loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. Or take what are called the Great Commandments. Some people have seen this as the core of Jesus' ethical teaching. These well-known texts, familiar to you, I presume, already. Now, is this what's meant by cooperation in game theoretical models? Is it an attempt to operationalize these claims that drives game theoretical work on cooperation? Clearly not. In fact, I looked in various online resources for the word cooperate or cooperation in various translations of the Hebrew text and the Greek text. The term doesn't come up at all. The closest you can get is synergai, or to work together. So we do have texts calling us to work together. So in the New Testament, Christians are called to work together in this fashion. Synergai, like the word synergy. And there's a sense of the body working together, but not primarily the language of cooperation. New Testament doesn't offer an ethics of cooperation as such, though it may stem from other tasks that the New Testament does offer. Putting the interests of the whole community above the competing interests of the individuals. Now, texts like what I've just shown you are moving stuff. You look at them and say, those are moving ethical values. Whatever religious tradition I come from, or no religious tradition, I can see something uplifting in these texts. And yet, at least at first blush, this thought world is worlds apart from how we actually speak of cooperation and model cooperation in game theory. Worlds apart. Let's take a recent publication from Christoph Hauert from PED. The mathematical model should always reflect that contributing to a public goods enterprise is a risky investment whose eventual return depends on other players. Right? There wasn't much in the text that we just looked at, the scriptural text, that fits into that framework. Now, maybe we could draw a bridge there. Maybe there's a way in which that risk is implicit, say in Hebrew Bible or New Testament passages. And maybe we could find a way to operationalize that risk. But at least the first sense is that sense of difference. By the way, the eventual return depends on other players. That's not prayers, by the way. Right? I'm going to argue that there's nothing anti-religious about the game theoretical work. But a conceptual task remains to be carried out that we still have to work on. Next presupposition, that it's important to find ways to bridge the gap. Right? I wanted to spend the entire hour just talking about why that might be an important task. Why, for theologians, it might be important to take seriously the mathematical models. Why the context of the evolution of behavior, the biological evolution of behaviors, is crucial. Why it matters whether a strategy, some set of principles that a group lives by, is evolutionarily stable. See, if it's not evolutionarily stable, then over the course of evolution, it will be overtaken by a different set of principles. Or we have the question, how would such a set of principles arise in the first place? I mean, I would love to take half an hour to convince you why that's a problem for standard religious ethics. It's an issue we have to take on board. Where do ethical principles and behaviors come from, and how are they sustained over evolutionary history? I'm fighting the temptation, but that's presupposed in the talk. Likewise,
I would like to take the time to talk about why it's important for people working in the empirical and mathematical side to try to do the bridging. Why to work on mathematical models of human decision-making principles by themselves without opening up to ethical reflection is a mistake. Why it's an arbitrary limitation of the very project that one's involved in, namely looking for adequate empirical models for making sense of human behavior and human decision-making. I'm fighting the temptation. Both of those I presuppose here, but don't possibly have the time to cover. All right. The title presupposes that the questions in the empirical study of cooperation are laden with deep religious significance. I've listed 4 of the ways in which the standard questions raise fundamental questions for religious traditions and for the way in which people do religious ethics, reflect on human decision-making. Right? I take these connections to be intrinsic to the project as well. But I can't give that talk today. I have to presuppose that you at least see the desirability of the bridges. And maybe we can come back to that, and during the discussion you want to fight whether those are even desirable in the first place. Anyway, all right. The title presupposes that one bridges the gap by constructing models. But look, models exist on both sides. There are models in mathematical biology, that's what we work with, and there are models of religious behavior. There are theological models. Okay. There are 2 ways of thinking about models that would draw a bridge between these 2 banks. One type of bridge is built out of a single line or a single piece, say a single concept that runs all the way across the span. I believe that there is no single concept that really bridges these 2 discussions, these 2 fields. But other types of bridges are built of many smaller pieces or modules, and it's only by constructing those pieces one by one by one that one can actually get across. I presuppose that this is the kind of discussion we have to deal with, that there are individual modules. Let me state my thesis statement right at the outset because half of you may fall asleep before I get to the end. The thesis statement is this: perhaps the most we can hope in the project on the evolution and theology of cooperation is to agree on what are the pieces, the modules that constitute the bridge from mathematical biology to theology. Even if, let's state it honestly, most of us are much more interested in 1 or 2 of these pieces, and few of us in the ground are interested in drawing the bridge all the way across. Right? If it's modular, then I can draw from your interest in game theory and your interest in ethics and your interest in theology and your interest in philosophical anthropology or whatever they are to gradually build the pieces. And those who are interested in constructing the bridge out of the pieces can then see how they're fit together, whether they make a single structure or not. Do you understand? We don't have to presuppose a single golden key that's going to unlock the whole thing. If we just had that concept in our hands, we would have reconciled contemporary work in mathematical biology and work in theology. I don't think it exists. But we can make progress on specific disciplinary areas that are part of that project. All right? I'm not sure there's a single language, but I'm looking for a sort of path through the wilderness of conceptual confusion that we could follow. Not a single theory, but a way to sort of see how to get from here to the Matterhorn or whatever that's supposed to be in the background. All right. The 2-fold challenge I included on your handout. First, to theologians and students of religion, to take the empirical work seriously. These are best explanations that we have, the most rigorous scientific explanations that we have of human behavior. I presuppose that mathematical biology is gradually transforming, even revolutionizing, the study of biology, and that scientists won't go back to a pre-mathematical way of speaking of the evolution of biological systems. Right? That makes this is the future of biology. If you're a theologian or a student of religion interested in such matters, you have to deal with the best that's out there. And that means you have to deal with its assumptions and its framework, and not a sort of sugar-coated version of it. You have to look at the models we're actually coming up with. And the other half of the 2-fold challenge, to biologists, the work deals with fundamental questions of what the human person is. Questions of human behavior, human motivations, human values, the very nature of human existence. To refuse those questions To exclude such questions as meaningless would leave the models themselves, well, uninterpreted, and therefore less useful for us in the long run. The twofold challenge then is that both disciplines need the other side. The bridging task is one that we have to take on. All right, does everyone have the handout? The only way I can do a 2-hour lecture in 35 minutes is to have you look at the outline and not get lost. Could somebody, Mara or somebody, help me by finding extra copies somewhere? They must be piled up. If you have extra copies near you, maybe you could raise them up, and we'll get them across. Okay? I'm going to keep going, all right? Right. I'd like to offer 8 models for bridging the gap, and have you help me decide, or actually I'll suggest rather unshyly which are credible and which not. I've divided them into, what do we have, 4 categories on your handout, all right, to give you a rough orientation. Category 1, cutting any links between game theory and religion from the start. That happens mostly in the literature on both sides, the religious side and the biological side. Here are 2 ways to cut any links. So here's your model number 1. Actually, these aren't models for building the bridge, but Amy, there's Judy. These are ways to say no bridge can be built, and who cares, right? So the first model, religion's irrelevant to human behavior. Religious beliefs can't be modeled, or if they could be, they would not affect the outcome of any modeling work. You know what? I don't know, I'd have to ask Martin during the discussion. I think that's widely held among people in mathematical biology. You might as well state it at the outset. Maybe half the people in this room say, well, actually, that's true. And the rest is just going to be hopeful thinking, right? That's a possibility. But then we should be honest about what that implies for bridging between the evolution and theology of cooperation. I think that that's false. I think there's lots of evidence in the world that religion deeply influences human behavior, politically, socially, economically, and the rest. Model number 2, game theory provides no knowledge of systems in which religious beliefs operate. Credo ut absurdum. I believe because it's absurd. Game theory can never say anything to it. Or look, here's a New Testament passage. Try to model this game theoretically. I mean, it seems to be more of a no to any attempt to look at the way in which religious beliefs would lead one to act in a rational way, in terms of one's own rational self-interest, over evolutionary time. Right? And these are the sorts of passages that might be raised to support option number 2. It doesn't look like this will allow the sort of computation that we presume agents are involved in when they work. All right, heading number 2. Game theory tests and presumably falsifies religion. I would say that these next 2 headings, at least this idea that game theory tests and presumably falsifies religious ethics, shows it not really to be a viable mode for human decision making, is also widely held within people working in mathematical biology. So let's start with the first explicit thesis. Game theory falsifies religion, or at least greatly reduces its credibility. Take, for example, this statement from Bulbulia in a 2004 article. Quote, religious commitments nearly universal in our species, but religion is costly, involves trials, ordeals, resource outlays, and the foregoing of opportunities. Religion is simply hard to square with evolutionary theory because selection tends to minimize waste. Religion is wasteful. Selection over evolutionary time minimizes waste. While functionalist theories of religious cognition are plentiful, it's hard to see why selection could not provision these functions without waste. Now, Bulbulia himself tries to answer the objection. He uses game theory and the biology of animal signaling to try to show that, quote, religious costs are adaptive because the costs themselves serve as adaptive signals that structure and authenticate group commitment. That may be right. That may be a sufficient answer. But the objection is nonetheless widespread. Think, for example, of Pascal Boyer's treatment of religion in Religion Explained. Boyer writes, probably you know these texts, the idea that we're gullible or superstitious is certainly true. Religion's about being gullible and superstitious. But, humans aren't gullible in every sort of way, in every sort of circumstance.
people don't generally manage to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. So religion's all about being gullible and believing absurd things. But let's draw some correlations between environment and belief in absurd things. One of the absurdest things that religious people believe is about ethics, what they ought to do. So let's try to understand how such strange beliefs might have arisen empirically. And he adds 2 pages later, I don't think that people have religion because they relax their usually strict criteria for evidence and accept these strange claims. They're led to relax their criteria because some extraordinary claims have become quite plausible to them. So the explanation of religion is to understand how humans could have such dumb beliefs and such crazy ideas about what constitutes a way that one should act in the world. Right? This fits very well in this context of tension. Number 4, model number 4. And by the way, Pascal Boyer is one of the most respected people in the explanation of religious beliefs and religious ethical maxims. So that would be an extremely widespread response. You note, of course, that if Boyer is right, you're not going to get a bridge from the biology of behavior to theology, right? Pascal Boyer drops a bomb in the middle and watches the pieces crumble, gleefully, perhaps. All right. Model 4. This is slightly more open. Game theory allows us to test religious claims empirically, to preserve what stands up to test, and to reject the rest. So here's what this approach does. Listen. Let's look at some religious suggestions for organizing society, religious ethics or religious social theory. Let's take these suggestions as hypotheses. Let's model them using our existing models or design some new models to try to model them in a more adequate way. And then let's let the game run. Let's find out whether one obtains a strict Nash equilibrium. Let's see whether these strategies represent evolutionarily stable strategies. If so, great. We understand how they could have evolved and been preserved. If not, then we have a sort of falsification. Right? Well, what might we take? Well, I suppose we'd go to something like the Sermon on the Mount. Let's take this as a maxim for behavior, and let's model it and see whether it represents an evolutionarily stable strategy. Ask with me the question. I'd love to resolve that tonight during the discussion. What happens if you have an infinitely large population consisting of a fraction of cooperators X and 1 minus X defectors? That's the basic assumption of evolutionary dynamics. Is always cooperate in this sense, and whatever more subtle version of it might arise, an evolutionarily stable strategy? How many say yes? How many say no? Empirically, no. I mean, that's not a difficult empirical question. We have models, and they seem to suggest it's not ESS. It's not an evolutionarily stable strategy. Okay? What are religious people going to do about that? I see people turning back to numbers 1 and 2 again in the handout. Right? I mean, that's a conflict. That matters. If this is the core of a Christian religious ethic, and it's not a strategy that we could understand how it could have arisen or could have been preserved, isn't that a problem? At least prima facie, it would seem to be. Right. But now, of course, some of the opposing options aren't stable either. You have heard it was said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Is that an evolutionarily stable strategy? How many would say it's not a stable strategy over time? Well, simple tit for tat is not a stable strategy. So that we can't just bounce back to an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We need more complex models, right? So it's not just bad news for the most lofty, exciting sorts of, stirring sorts of ethical mandates. The models are also a problem for some of the ones that we might consider to be morally less praiseworthy, right? G.A. Dinhard argues that game theory serves to explain the function and existence of moral norms and to help to rationally justify those norms. That fits nicely under this heading, number 4. Look at the 2 parts of the quote. I think there's a lot of depth in that project. Part 1 is to explain moral norms. And by that, he's very clear, to explain their function and their existence. Part 2, game theory may justify them. It may help to rationally justify those norms. If religious norms stand up to that kind of testing, they're better off, in a sense, than they were before, rationally speaking. Right? All right, let's move on to heading C. A student challenged me today, said, don't you dare just give us the bad ones and then leave out what you think might be a successful answer to the problem.
So you've got to get to the final points of the lecture. So you'll excuse me for moving quickly through the other ones. Category C, the only common ground between religion, do you have it on the handout, right? Between religion or theology and game theory is functionalism. Religious beliefs sometimes impact human behaviors, and game theory can help to study these behaviors, right? So that would give you model number 5, right? So let's play with that just for a minute, and then I'll move on. One assumes that religion should function as a strongly cohesive force, at least for the in-group. I mean, when you have a statement like this, drawing everyone together to feel one within their religious identity, previous differences that might have made them combatants are supposed to be overcome now, right? So what do our models tell us about the factors that contribute to this sort of cooperation? We've got another recent article by Martin and his collaborators. Punishment and reputation, this is just a restatement of basic premise, have been identified as very potent promoters of human cooperation in social dilemmas. So let's look for a moment at punishment and cooperation. If an individual has to punish, he accrues certain costs, social costs. Punishment is it's also a puzzling phenomenon in human actions. But what if a religious group includes the threat of future punishment for defectors? So what if the belief system held by the group takes away the need for an individual to have to punish defectors? What if holding those beliefs already decreases the likelihood of defection without the social costs of punishment? You see? Now that's a game. A group that has that built in has an advantage that another group doesn't, where there may have to be costly punishment, costly for individuals. So it may be that if you could somehow get that belief going, you would have a more stable strategy than the option. Religion, thereby, perhaps, can contribute significantly to cooperation. The only trouble is, modern liberal religious thinkers like myself don't like to think that the real function of religion in evolutionary history is to threaten some sort of cosmic punishment. We think of that as the Puritans in the 17th century or something, who overemphasized the punishment. What if game theory suggested that the real point of religion was that it held up that cosmic paddle and threatened to punish those who didn't collaborate? I mean, for us liberals, that would be a very disappointing outcome, right? And yet there's some reason to think that religion would do a great job at carrying out that sort of a function. I'm going to have to skip over the reputation side, the ways in which religion might help to add to that reputation, which helps us find stable strategies involving indirect reciprocity. All right, let's move on to model number 6. Okay, put quote marks around, don't put quote marks around irrational. Religion might serve as a source of irrational behaviors. It might motivate people to act altruistically, even when doing so is not in their own best interest. So let's imagine that we have some particular set of social interactions which are versions of the prisoner's dilemma. That's number 1. I think you all know this, right? T is the temptation to defect, seek to gain for yourself at the cost of another. R is reward when both cooperate. P, the punishment when neither cooperates. S, the sucker's payoff. That's when I act for the good of the other and the other player doesn't act for my good, right? And prisoner's dilemma is defined by this order, right? Now, what if my religion causes me to hold the biologically false belief about the payoff ranking? What if I believe number 2? R is greater than S is greater than P than greater than T. So I always cooperate, no matter what the defectors around me are doing, right? This is not an evolutionarily stable strategy, right? So you can say, okay, so religion leads to cooperation within a group, but only by holding a false belief about the dynamics of the interaction. Now it kind of has a positive function, but only by leading us to hold false beliefs. Again, for most religious believers, not a happy outcome, right? Okay, well, let's make it more complex. What if I actually know that the truth is 1, but my religion tells me to act as if 2? So I know the truth, right? I know what leads to and know what the actual payoffs are, but my religion asks me, maybe because of some other set of values or norms, to follow route number 2. Right? That's a somewhat more positive view of the contribution of religion. It might contribute to a social group, an in-group anyway, that had a lot of survival chances as over against competing groups. So if we can accept the premise of group selection, as I do, as Martin does, and many of the people, I presume most of the people working at PE, but I'm not sure, if we accept the premise of group selection, then we can see a selective advantage. And we have the possibility that the people know what's true, but have been convinced to act as if something else were true. David Sloan Wilson has beautifully worked this out in a book called Darwin's Cathedral about Geneva in the 16th century, and showing how Calvinism led to a social structure which was economically incredibly powerful for that society. It led people to act in a way that strengthened the in-group over against competing groups, right? By acting in certain ways. It's a complex story. I can't summarize it here. But you can see how this might be a way to bridge. This is the most hopeful so far. The religious person might feel that her beliefs were accounted for and included, and yet the game theorist could say we don't have a contradictory state of affairs here. So now it's getting to be a little bit more subtle. This might be one we'd want to come back to. All right, I'm going to move on more quickly. Let's look at number 7. This is our final category now. Game theory and theology could be mutually enhancing, it says under D. That is, each can provide a dimension of understanding not available to the other. All right? Let's look at the thesis. Religious beliefs might come from other sources, and there's no need for biology to reject this possibility. Game theory might actually help to complete religion, to fill in some missing pieces, even to aid in religious decision-making. Now, for the first time, we have a real partnership. Right? I want to take an example from the 2005 Nobel Prize laureate for economic science, Robert Aumann, who's now at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Aumann is a specialist both in math and Talmudic studies. So it's an interesting example. Sergei Hart once asked him, quote, Robert, a world populated by rational players, so game theoretical players, is it consistent with the religious view? Isn't there, in a sense, an extra player, which would be God, or something that you cannot understand by rational means? An extra, non-rationally driven player. And do you get it? Underneath that question is the question, so don't you have a conflict? As a Jew who's a specialist in game theory, isn't there some sort of inherent conflict? Meyer Levinson gave a great summary of his response, which I'll use here. As she summarizes his response, he said, game theory fits perfectly with religion. It clarifies exactly those areas of life that Torah and Rabbinic Judaism left blank. While Judaism tells us that we must give to charity, it doesn't tell us how much. Game theory principles do. While Judaism tells us we must not cheat our neighbors when bargaining, it doesn't tell us how to bargain. Game theory does. This was not tongue-in-cheek, as far as I could tell from the transcript. This is a serious response. We can have Torah revealed, so 617 principles for behavior, but it doesn't answer all the questions. This is a great statement of Rabbinic Judaism. It's left to humankind to work out rationally the implications of Torah. Torah is given from another source, but once we have it, then we have to act in accordance with it. So I think Aumann really means this to be a partnership, right? The ultimate questions, why these laws, that's a religious question. What to do with the laws, that's a game theoretical question, right? And Levinson then summarizes, I think, lovely at the end. In essence, Aumann purports that game theory not only explains and predicts interactions between people in various venues, but it can be used to understand divine imperative. It seems that God, she writes, who may not have dictated game theory to Moses at Mount Sinai, was at least a fan of it. Now there's a synthesis, ladies and gentlemen. That's the first bridge that goes all the way across with full respect for both sides. Right? The last one. The transition from game theoretical modeling in science to ethics, to philosophical anthropology, possibly to theology. This is the one that I want to offer is my own view, and I have 10 whole minutes rather than 2 to carry it out. So I'll just let number 7 stand. Let the Aumann position stand as a possibility. Let me supplement it from another, right? It's interesting that there's a definite Christian tinge to the one I'm about to present and a rabbinic tinge to the one that Aumann's presenting. It may be that the responses will be as diverse as the religious traditions we're talking with. Let me underscore that point. It may be that we falsely pose the question, which actually the grant doesn't falsely pose, how is game theory and religion to be unified? It may be game theory and this particular religious tradition or subsection of a tradition. Rabbinical Judaism is not the same as Kabbalah, right? So it may be that we need to be much more specific in building these bridges and not speak in the vague terms of religion as such. All right, so if there's a bridge, what are its modular parts? Let me offer a first try, right, with thanks to Mara for helping with the graphics, since I'm graphically challenged. All right? I spell out the steps of the argument on the handout, and I want to concentrate most on the first step, from game theory to the internalization of norms. Just touch briefly on the others. We can come back to them at later points. Why concentrate so much on the first one? The history of game theory is as an attempt to overcome explanations of human behavior based solely on the intentions of agents. If you're trying to explain some system of interacting agents, and you have to have full knowledge of their internal intentional world, it turns out to be impossible to model their behaviors in a scientific fashion. So the Cartesian says, well, yes, of course, they're ins cogitans, they're rational beings or spiritual beings, and they're acting according to that, right? But you can't begin science with that. So game theory said, let's just blank out that part of the scale, and let's do the modeling of agents, making the assumption that they're rational agents, that they act in accordance to what the actual scores are, right? So to get from 1 to 2 is not trivial. If you work in game theory, you should worry that if you make that move at all, you've sold out on your discipline as a whole, right? Now, I'm going to try to argue that once we take game theory as established, we take it that biology is not going to move back below that point any longer. Scientific biology now has this permanently as a core of how we do the biology of behavior. If you'll give me that assumption, then I want to say it then becomes possible as we move to interpretation and broader bridging efforts to include that internal dimension in a way that we couldn't when the advocates were trying to get game theory off the ground. Right? That's the thesis for this section. Step 1, the evolution of increasingly complex agents. This one seems hard to deny. Over the course of evolutionary history, whether of necessity or Simon Conway Morris, or by chance, Stephen Jay Gould, more complex biological agents have arisen. I have 27 examples, but we'll just let that stand. All right? Part of this complexity involves the internal modeling that these agents do. And here's just one story. This is based on fieldwork, though the cartoon is not. Is not exactly what it's drawn. We have a graphic representation. So what do we see? Okay, look at the bottom is what we see. We've got an agent A. Let's say her name is Andrea, screaming. You've got T. Actually, the first step is T, who has just unearthed a really delicious root that everyone knows is delicious, and we've got the mother of Andrea looking away. All right. So that's what we have, the behavior of screaming of Andrea. All right? Now, what went on to explain that behavior? The researchers postulated the 3-part scenario at the top. All right? First, Andrea must have known that if she screamed and her mom turned around, her mom would think that, let's call him Thomas, had done something like bite her tail. Right? Secondly, Andrea thought that her mom, here called the tool, would chase away poor Thomas, who's got a question mark above his head. He doesn't know what's happening.
right? And then below that Andrea would have access to the root. By the time Thomas got back, she would have had a lovely dinner, right? That's a complex situation. That bacteria don't do that kind of modeling, right? To have an adequate explanation of her behavior, the screaming, we have to construct something like that story, right? So in the process of complexification, these more complex inner worlds or inner modeling are crucial. We call that the theory of other minds, highly disputed in primatology to what extent, say, chimps have a theory of other minds. I think the evidence shows that they do. We could fight over that in the discussion. Right. Step 2 on your sheet. When the players become more complex, the dynamics are not identical. So increases in complexity of the sort shown on the overhead slide bring new factors into the interactions, and these factors are relevant to the explanation and the prediction of behavior. Do you understand? An empirically adequate theory of behaviors like this, and on up the complexity scale from here, needs to include that complex scenario which involves inner modeling or inner picturing as well. All right? It would be fun to speculate about some of these steps of increased complexification. The increased role of idiosyncratic figures, that is, behaviors not dictated by genes alone but involving the phenotype, the individual. The dynamics of cultural evolution. I'd love to talk about that in detail. Increasingly complex inner representations, that's what we've just looked at. The arising of symbolic language, as in Terry Deacon's The Symbolic Species, and in self-consciousness. Those are the sorts of steps we might want to look at, right? If these are true, then to explain behaviors, let's say in the lower 3, we have to say something about the nature of the actors in question. I'm fascinated by the way, now we're on to point 3, the way in which Herb Simon, and building on Herb Simon, especially Herb Gintis, has moved in this direction in recent years. Here's his recent work. This is it's on the bibliography, which you should have received as well, from The Hitchhiker's Guide to Altruism. Actually, a fascinating article that I recommend to you. Gene Culture Coevolution and the Internalization of Norms. This, for me, helps make that movement from 1 to 2 in the sketch that we had. So here you have a description of some of the sort of internal sanctions that influence behavior, in addition to, I wouldn't actually say as opposed to, purely external sanctions. All right? Moving on. So he wants to begin with Herb Simon's early explanation of altruism, and Gintis argues that altruistic norms can hitchhike on this general tendency of internal norms to be personally fitness enhancing. It would take us half an hour to unpack this, but just look at the second sentence. A multi-level selection, gene culture coevolution argument explains why individually fitness-reducing internal norms are likely to be pro-social as opposed to socially harmful. That's an empirical claim. If it stands up, building on the foundations of mathematical biology, we can build a second level of complexity on top of the earlier level. And that, I'm arguing, is the next major node or movement in the bridge that one might build. I'd love to cover in more detail an analogous argument that is in Daniel Dennett's recent book on religion, Breaking the Spell. Dennett recognizes, he moves beyond the pure rational choice theory of some game theorists, and in quotes like this and others, recognizes the role of religion as bringing a level of value that transcends the genetic imperative. The contrast between Dawkins and Dennett, for example, is that Dennett recognizes there are multiple dynamics of evolution. Dawkins tends to reduce to the biological or Darwinian dynamic, despite the press that Dennett gets. In fact, he recognizes these multiple modes in which evolution can operate. Caveat, or seems to, because then when he begins to explain it with meme theory, you get an implicit reduction back to what are basically Darwinian dynamics. Right? So you have at least an opening in Dennett. Try that out on him the next time you're at Tufts and see if he thinks that's a convincing argument. Okay, I need to move to a close. This is the next point under that heading. Peter Berger and the Internal Worlds of Meaning. if we can go a step beyond what Dennett is willing to go, if you leave out the meme theory, it's just a mistake, a bad way of understanding the dynamics of culture, then you could speak of this internal dimension as involving the quest for meaning of these individual agents. Do you see how this is a more robust account than the two that we just looked at prior to it? This attempt for humans, more general attempt to impose our own order on experience. All right, now let's go back to the chain. Game theory, I've just been working mostly on the internalization of norms. That, if we had time, we could talk about the ways in which the other links can be built. This is actually less problematic. I think if we could make the move from 1 to 2, we have the foundations to continue the discussion further, from the internalization of norms to development of ethical theories. Those are theories about what constitutes the good. What are the meta-principles by which some set of actors acts? Formulating not only in terms of their consequences, but perhaps in terms of other motivations of behavior, other meta-rules of behavior. Always act in such a way that you increase the good of the other. Always act according to the principle, never according to its consequences. Act in such a way as to increase virtue. Do you understand? These are now, at a higher level, broader maxims, meta-principles of behavior. Right? If you get number 2, I think it's not difficult to get to number 3. If you get to ethical theory, then the question is natural. So what kind of animal is it who acts according to maxims of that sort? Who's preoccupied with the question, for example, of altruistic behavior? And we could talk about the nature of that animal. And once you ask about the nature of human beings as such, one can at least see the transition to a theological account. A theological account is one that speaks of the cosmos as sacred. Again, Berger, seeing the sacred cosmos confronted by humanity as an immensely powerful reality other than ourselves. I've gotten rid of the sexist language. Yet this reality addresses itself to us and locates our life in an ultimately meaningful order. The last 3 words characterize the religious dimension, the theological dimension. The sense that we dwell within an ultimately meaningful order. All right. The last thing to say as I close is that these steps that we've been talking about are in fact overlapping circles. They wouldn't be a bridge otherwise, would they? And I want to say that the work in game theory in this overlap area, and it may be small, but it's enough to begin to have us consider the element of internalization, that moment. If we can build this module, I actually would have loved that this one came on top of the other one, but there you go. If the internalization could be built on that lower platform, like running Word on top of your operating system or something, right? Then we don't have to question this. I mean, obviously, if the electronics of your computer stopped functioning, it wouldn't be running Windows XP. And if Windows XP stops functioning, as mine did halfway through this talk, it won't be storing the words in Word. And if Word's not running, you won't be writing your brilliant novel, right? So each of the lower ones stays in place. It's not superseded, but rather levels of description or explanation can be built on top of that, right? So this could be built on top of this one, ethical theory on top of that one, and so forth. And now you have a chain, you have a bridge that in principle could let us bridge between the ethics and the theology of cooperation. I'm going to stop there. Thanks. I'd love to debate it. Yeah, that was the point. To see if we could engage in some discussion with it. Yeah, please.
Thanks for the talk. Very interesting. I had a quick comment and then a question.
Yeah.
The comment was about number 7, the 7th model.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
Yeah, where it says ET might actually help to complete religion. So you told that Robert Aumann story about how game theory can tell us how to bargain, for example.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you shouldn't replace religion with knowledge there. I mean, if I learn something about bargaining, I haven't really completed my religion. I've just completed my knowledge, right?
Now, that's a very interesting question. And a very unrabbinical question.
A very what?
Unrabbinical.
Okay.
Right? Because for me as an Orthodox Jew,
My religion is my observance. For me to act in accordance with Torah is the core of religion. It's not an internal state. It's not whether I believe or believe in the right way about God. And it's not the motivation for my actions. Actually, that's a little more complicated. But it's the carrying out of the actions. If my life mirrors in the deepest way those principles that God revealed, then I'm living my religion to the fullest. Second, religiousness doesn't rule out rationality. Again, for me as a rabbinical Jew, study is an important part of my calling. To act rationally in accordance with revealed law is almost the highest description I could give of religious observance. So I would say no conflict whatsoever. Thank you for your Christian sounding discussion. I don't know. But
Okay.
I emphatically say no.
Okay. My question was about the bridge that you're proposing. I'm wondering what the arrow between game theory and the internalization of norms signifies.
Okay?
So I'm wondering, is the idea that we take our game theory and it gives us evidence for the truth of certain normative claims, or is the idea rather that game theory gives an explanation of why humans tend to hold certain normative claims as true, or maybe some third thing?
Okay, that's a great question. I meant to get at that question in the earlier categories when I spoke of functionalism. Right? And for a religious person, the question you just asked may matter ultimately. For, let's say, a Christian now, where this question comes up more often, that question may be the most important question to ask about this entire talk. Right? Because, on the one hand, if it turns out that the actions I carry out as a Christian are function in an in evolutionary satisfactory manner, but their value is completely captured by their functional, right, by their functional success, then I'll say the very essence of my religion has been torn away. Because it's not just that it happens to lead to the good of me or my in-group. My motivation was the opposite. To be a part of God's divine love manifested for all of humanity, of a salvific plan which transcends any in-group to the final goal that all shall be one and all manner of things shall be one. Right? So the functional account that the game theorist offers me, I might say, absolutely not, I don't want to touch it. It falsifies the core of what I'm about as a Christian. Or I might say, the other answer would be no problem. Why shouldn't true beliefs or ethically correct maxims have positive behavioral implications? And there's a whole school in ethics called eudaimonism that says when you do the good, it brings about happiness. Actually, that's American evangelical Christianity, I'm afraid, in a lot of respects, right? The gospel of success. So we're going to have to come back to it, but that's a really good question. That's not my one.
Yeah, I would like to add to your reply.
Yeah.
So game theory is used in biology differently than how it is used in economics.
Say more about that.
And in biology, the question would essentially be, if you tell me here's a certain behavior like love your enemy, or a certain imperative for a behavior, or another behavior like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, then as a biologist, I would use game theory to ask the question, can I explain this behavior with natural selection? So this is what we want. So the individual who does this, what advantage would this individual actually get at the biological level, where we have to assume that it's a competitive world and a behavior that has a fitness advantage in some sense will spread over others. But we always have to keep in mind that a selection can act on two levels, as you have also hinted at, so on the individual level and on a group level. So it could be that something looks very strange and very hard to explain on the individual level. But religious beliefs might bind groups together, and then the group gets an advantage.
What's your name? Yeah. Sorry? Mike, I couldn't see you back here. So how would you respond to Mike if he said, Martin, if you explain its evolutionary effect, I've lost. As soon as you explain it in terms of its evolutionary effect, you've somehow undercut the religious stance. I took that possibility to be in the back of Mike's. Yeah, but there are people who would make that response. Martin, would you say that's a mistake?
No, so I think that we should try to explain everything with natural selection and with sort of a Darwinian evolutionary approach, which doesn't mean like a genetic approach. It can be like cultural evolution. And such an explanation does not in
share that position. And I think, in fact, if this project is going to work, we have to share that assumption. But I want to underscore that many, say, Christian theologians would strongly disagree. I took it that that was what Mike was hinting at. And the school of thought would say, if you can explain some belief or more, ethical norm by natural selection, you've undercut its value religiously. So it's a zero-sum game. The better you do, the worse off the religious person is. Actually, let's just underscore that. If zero-sum game is true, ETC is a problem. It presupposes it's not a zero-sum game, but increase in the strength of explanations from natural selection do not decrease the value of the religious realm, but the two can both be increased thereby. That's never been stated, I think. But I think that's an underlying assumption of the program. And you've just formulated it.
But why would we have undercut it? This I don't understand.
Well, let's see if there's someone in the audience who actually wants to take the position. Since I don't hold it, I probably shouldn't. But I saw lots of hands, so let me... Yeah, okay, Sarah.
Might be another way of stating the same problem. It seems to me that your whole talk has operated on the assumption that you want to explain a level of evolution at which the question of God would come up. All right. But you're entirely asking this question anthropologically. You've completely bracketed the question about whether God exists. Now, if we start from, in other words, I could be Mark Hauser and say, thank you very much. This helps explain, how further down the road, perhaps in the complexification of game theory, we can give a complete explanation of how people come to the delusionary idea that they've got to talk about God. Right. But it would still utterly beg the metaphysical question of whether God exists. And an entirely different way of talking about bridges would start in a different way. It would ask whether the very phenomena of cooperation which Martin and co are now charting suggests, as a piece of natural theology, that a God of a certain sort does exist. Do you see how this is a completely... I would see this as a sort of Schleiermacherian project. Let's explain how the idea of God comes into the human psyche. All right? And we can complexify game theory until we get there. I'm not very interested in that because, although it might help create some of these extra models of means of linking to biologists, it will still leave the big question, which I think our project is engaged in, of whether game theory helps us to construct an argument for God's existence.
That is a crucial clarification. May I pause just a moment? I see your hand. Let me just pause for a moment because it has to do with the fundamental nature of this project. Right. Sarah, there are three ways of interpreting this ladder. I actually meant the third. Right. The first way to interpret the ladder is purely functional. So we know the way in which game theory functions to explain behavior. Internalization as another functional dimension, but really reducing downward. That would be Hauser or Pinker. Right. Ethical theory is a more complex way of expressing these dynamics, which are more complex ways of expressing these dynamics, so it really reduces down to this. And likewise, all the way down. All right? That would indeed be bad news for theology. I would say under any account, but that's a strong statement. Number two, the Schleiermacherian approach. I didn't intend that tonight, but I would love to explore that with you later. I think there's a tertium quid that would be fascinating to explore. But I intended the strongest possible sense, your sense of theology. You're a PI, so I owe you that respect. Okay? And it meant as follows. We know what this is. Okay. When I made the internalization of norms, I meant to speak of the reality of an internal dimension not reducible to this. Right. The fact that I used Bennett probably misled you because you think of him as a bad guy. Right? And mean theory, I agree, has this tendency to reduce us downward. Right? But I was actually using him against his wishes, trying to pull out a few sentences out of a 400-page book that might be helpful, where he seemed to recognize that another type of dynamic was occurring here. I take the word evolution, like Martin, in a very broad sense. There are multiple dynamics of evolution. Darwinian dynamics, Lamarckian dynamics, cultural dynamics, and so forth. This dynamic is a different dynamic from this and not reducible explanatorily to the lower. That means it's a really different. It's not functional in the same sense. This dynamic is the dynamic in which a vision of the good, Sarah, this is right up your alley,
might motivate people to act in a certain way. Meta-ethics are about visions of the good under one school. Philosophical anthropology asks an essence question. What's the essence of the human person? Essence questions don't come up in game theory. You don't model essence claims. They're modal claims about what is our necessary or built-in nature. And this might give rise to real statements about the existence of God. What I should have done is then, Mara and I should have now created a chart with arrows going back down again. I admit that as a natural theologian I might work out this way. But then you can turn the arrows around and give a sort of explanatory account back down the chart. Right? But that's where you're talking about. Sorry, he was next, and then Mari.
I would question that that biology and evolution can be reduced to game theory. I had the privilege of talking to Ernst Mayr, the pioneer of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, shortly before he died at about age 100. Yeah. And he had absolutely no use for mathematical modeling. He said it's predicted absolutely nothing new. And I think E.O. Wilson, who's going to be speaking, I guess, in December, I think he would take a similar view. You might want to ask that. But
excellent. Biology is a broad brief, right? I focus on mathematical biology, which is our particular grant, but we could do the same terrain with other models of biology. That would be a fascinating discussion. Marie.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, are you worried at all that the more strongly anti or non-reductionistically you construe this ladder, the smaller the overlaps between the circles?
Nice point. That's a very important point. Yeah.
Are you worried about that?
Yeah, I'm worried. Because it'd be lovely if the circles overlapped to 85 or 90%, right? And I think you're right. That's a very intriguing point. They would only overlap to such a great extent if this level were very much like this level that is largely functional, right? And this level largely like that one. But then the reductive slide looks like my 4-year-old sliding down a slide. The reductive slide looks harder to avoid. If we begin to speak of them as more distinct, the overlap set reduces. Okay, Maurice, that's not a frightening question, though. It's a question of truth. If I have a strong enough understanding of norms to get me to something like classical ethical theory, is it so strong that the overlap set becomes zero? That's something we have to look at. So you've asked a brilliant conceptual question. If I make this strong enough to be in dialogue with this, do we now have slippage? And, our kids fall in the crack in the middle of the slide and crunch down on the ground, right? I'm going to hypothesize that the overlap set doesn't disappear. That's my program, number 8. But I think that you pointed to a danger in a very astute way. Okay, I see a hand back there.
I'm intrigued by knowing who really God is. It's not that I doubt, but...
We'll solve that tonight before you leave.
Yeah, but it seems to me like, we go through all these steps, and maybe there are many other ways that people in different parts of the world go through to get to the real God. We kind of miss sometimes. There's a danger. I guess that's my point. Mm-hmm. There's a danger in losing the real meaning of God, in trying to overlap this circle with the other one and the other one. I would say that's an ideal, but what do you think?
That's a great question. That's a fair question, actually. So you might say, Clayton, not only this discussion, but all these religion science discussions seem to take us away from what's the core of the religious instinct, which is response to ultimate reality, which reveals itself as gracious or in some ways grounding us, that we have some internal experience of, right, that we encounter in various ways. And all these sorts of debates, and in fact all these philosophical debates in general, not even religion science alone, take us away from that more core element. I recognize the attraction of the silence of the moment of religious connection, right? But there's something hard about silence. It doesn't let you say very much. Right? And if we allow ourselves both to preserve whatever's important in religious phenomena and to reflect on it, why can't we do both at the same time? Why is religious experience and reflection a zero-sum game? Why couldn't reflection, bridge building, enhance religious experience rather than undercut it?
I would like to make a comment. I greatly admire, of course, the work of Ernst Mayr, and I have read some of his books. I have to say this is like the work of Tycho de Brahe. Tycho de Brahe, he engraved the positions of 1,000 stars like on a huge hemisphere of the heavens. That was before Kepler. And so Tycho Brahe also didn't know about mathematical models or didn't care for mathematical models. But nowadays, an astronomer couldn't live without mathematical models. And the same sort of is happening in biology, and physics was 300 years earlier.
I personally believe it, but I'm saying he was very negative.
Yeah. Nice put. Please.
I have one comment and one question.
Great.
And the comment refers to model number 6. And you're talking about altruism and how it seems counter to evolution. But there are any number of instances in nature where we see altruism at work because it's not in the best interest of the individual, but it's in the best interest of the species.
Yeah.
Like a gazelle will sometimes, to protect the rest of the herd, will leap up and be obvious and make the predator go after him while the rest of the herd escapes.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's important to look at both in an evolutionary sense, both the evolution of the species and the best interest of the individual, because they're not the same all the time.
I would so much like to make that argument work. I remember being a kid, growing up in an atheist family, and my grandmother gave me this book about how nature revealed the hand of God. And she had examples like the gazelle and so forth, how nature reveals loving behaviors among animals. And I wish I could go back to the point where I could say, there's evidence that God has designed an order of loving behaviors that has altruism built into it. It turns out what we've learned over the last 30 or 40 years, already suggested actually by Darwin in 1871, was that's not actually true. That behaviors can appear to be altruistic, that is, I'm taking a higher cost to needs in order to help the group as a whole. But there are a variety of mechanisms that we've come to recognize that actually explain why it makes rational sense for members of a group to act in that way. And if we had time, we could talk about kin selection, reciprocal altruism, indirect reciprocity. And each of these are ways that we've gradually come to understand the biological system, why nature would accomplish selfish ends through altruistic appearing behaviors. The real puzzle is this, you guys, and I'll ask Martin the same question. If it turns out that universal altruism is an evolutionarily stable behavior, then we've got something, then we've got a real clash.
What is universal altruism?
That would be acting not just for the in-group, for the self or for the in-group, but a group could thrive over ESS, over the long period, by the maxim, always put the interests of others over your own interests, without any of the standard mechanisms for explaining altruistic behavior holding. If that were true, that would be a great anomaly of the sort that she wants us to encounter. I don't think we have evidence that universal altruism, except maybe in individuals, right? We might see them as anomalies. But a group which over time acts according to the maxim of universal altruism. I don't believe we have empirical evidence anywhere in the animal kingdom, for example.
What about all the bees that have no direct descendants at all, but they take care of their nieces and nephews? That's universal among
social
bees.
instinct. Well, Martin can answer this better. But social instincts, where the survival of the hive comes through the behaviors. Hive phenomena are fascinating. Do you know that a hive has a personality that evolves over time? It's true of ants. For example, Deborah Gordon describes the 12-year life of an ant colony, and it has its own behavioral patterns, though any individual ant only lives for 1 year. So what you have is a kind of emergent entity, a group, and the group functions in a standard Darwinian way. There are really no anomalies there. We just have to see the units as contributing to the striving of the group as a whole. We could talk about that later in the discussion. 2 minutes. I think we're almost out of time. I'll stop now, or I'll take... Okay, sorry. Yeah.
I had a question also.
Okay. The chair was kind of kicking me under the table. So
it's just an important question for me, and it involves number 4, that allows us to test religious claims empirically, and then to preserve what stands up and what would be rejected. But don't most major religions insist that it's a package, and that you've got to accept all of it, and you can't just take some of it and throw it aside?
It's interesting. Well, if you took the history of Christianity, though that may be said,
In fact, you have incredible complexity of different movements and ideas, evolution of ideas over time. So I don't tend to see religions in their actual manifestation sociologically and historically as a single block. I see them as really complex groups of interactions. There may be a sort of core belief, like the Great Commandment or something, may have a foundational role, but all the beliefs that arise seem to evolve in major ways. We take one question, is there a question? Or what? You're chairing, so why don't you decide? One more question. I don't care. Please, go ahead. We'll have to talk afterwards.
I thought this was a very beautiful talk, and very aesthetically pleasing the way you laid out the need for a bridge.
Thanks. That's Mara, by the way. Any aesthetics is for her. My assistant.
Intellectually, aesthetically pleasing, in addition to on the screen. I'd like to talk about the water you're trying to avoid.
That.
Oh, that, yeah.
No, go ahead, please.
That's the humans or the other animals. And another thing, by bridging over, you're going from one abstraction to another abstraction. And one way to get from the top of one bank to the top of the other bank, instead of a bridge, walk down, wade in, find out what's going on, and then you're across.
Yeah. Well, you're using my model a little bit painfully against me, but it's such a poetic closing point. It makes a good closing question, doesn't it? The empirical work is occurring here. And this is the attempt to do biology in the most rigorous way possible. Biology is just our best study of the natural world. Now, it moves from a framework. I'm getting to where you want me to be, but just have to get there in a neater way. To get from this framework, study of behaviors, biology, to this framework, which is the sort of formulation of religious beliefs within the tradition. Right? The bridge gets me across, so I manage to have those two kind of join arms over a water. Okay, now if the bridge collapses, what really collapses, or where do I find myself? I may find myself in the straight empirical study of nature without that. I may find myself like the question of the one behind you, in an immediacy of religious experience and belief, not supported by this big structure. And maybe finding myself in either of those places is just as good or better than having been able to bridge the bridge. That I'm not able to how you're going to figure out. But if you pay close attention to the solar science as I do, if you seek to formulate a religious beliefs about the world as I do, then the building of bridges seems crucial towards this framework. So if I fall in the water, I'm safe. Thanks so much.
Many thanks to Philip Clayton for a very engaging and provocative lecture. Please be aware that we're very lucky to have Edward Wilson, E.O. Wilson, giving our next lecture in this series, which is to be on December the 14th in this room, 5:15. And he's going to be talking on the creation. Thank you. Do come. Many thanks.